Welcome back to Trash Talks, the official podcast of Second Life, where environmental conservation meets innovation. We are combining drone tech, AI, community, and research to restore our oceans and give the planet a second chance. From drone-powered cleanups to community-led activism, every week we dive into another topic that we hope will inspire you for change. So hello everyone, my name is Patricia and I am an intern at Second Life in the Public Affairs Department. And I am really excited to be one of your hosts today in this podcast, and I look forward to exploring a variety of topics together.
And hello, my name is Chiara Paternostro. I'm also an intern here in the Second Life Public Affairs Department. I'm excited and honored to be one of your hosts for today's episode of Trash Talks podcast. I'm excited to engage with our listeners, co-hosts, guests on this podcast about the mission of Second Life and how we can all make a difference in recycling, cleaner coastlines, and the development of AI technology. I hope you guys learned something from each and every episode.
In today's episode, we will start talking about the North Pacific Ocean, which contains the most significant accumulation of plastic waste. We are actually talking about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, or the GPGP, which sounds like something out of a dystopian sci-fi movie, but it's actually real and it's very massive.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, it's like a big old plastic soup. It's the largest of 5 offshore plastic accumulation zones in the world's ocean, and it's located halfway between Hawaii and California in the Pacific Ocean. And just to give you a sense of the scale, it covers about 1.6 million square kilometers. That's twice the size of Texas or 3 times the size of France.
Right? It's hard even to picture that. But it's not just about the size, right? It's about what is inside. Scientists have found that there are 180 times more plastic than marine life floating at the surface.
Yeah, just like taking a minute to think about that. For every fish, jellyfish, tiny plankton on the surface, there are 180 pieces of plastic. That's not just floating around doing nothing. It's being eaten by everything from the sea turtles to the seabirds.
Yeah, exactly. And sea turtles caught in the area have been found with up to 74% of their diet by dried weight made up of plastic, which is a lot. Then the less than albatross chicks from islands like Coratol as well. And their bodies can be made up of 45% plastic by wet mass. And that's almost half their body weight, just garbage.
I mean, it's just really devastating to think about. And it just shows us that our waste doesn't just disappear when we throw it into a trash can or a recycling bin. It just moves. It's out of sight to us, but definitely not without an impact. I mean, it's basically forming its own country in a way.
Exactly. So before we bring in our guest today, we would like to pause and discuss something that's often overlooked in conversations about ocean plastic, which are rivers, and more specifically, the politics of water, which is a topic very related to that.
Yes, because water isn't just a resource, it's power and infrastructure. And as a climate scientist, Giulio Boccaccioletti, puts it, the exercise of managing water is ultimately an exercise of power. Somebody needs to build something somewhere in somebody's backyard to control and manage water resources. And with that, some will benefit and some will lose.
Yeah, that's right. So whether we are talking about dams, levees, or waste management systems, these are all political choices. And the same principle applies on how we address plastic pollution. Because while a lot of attention is focused on the ocean, we have to remember also that most of that plastic originates upstream. It just doesn't appear in the ocean like that. It has a root, obviously.
Yes, which brings us to the Ocean Cleanup's 1,000 River Strategy. If you're not familiar with this strategy, it focuses on intercepting plastic from the world's most polluted rivers, because these rivers, many of which are small, urban, and often overlooked, are responsible for approximately 80% of the plastic that ends up in our oceans.
Yeah, and that's somewhere between 0.8 and 2.7 million metric tons of plastic per year, just from rivers. And the other 20%, that actually comes from marine sources like lost or abandoned fishing gear, ropes, nets, and even derelict vessels.
And here's where it's both inspiring and also shocking. These polluted rivers often run through densely populated communities that lack the infrastructure to manage waste. So plastic ends up in the water, travels downstream, and eventually finds its way into places like the Great Pacific Garbage Patch.
Yeah, it is a chain reaction. But the good news is that when you stop plastic at the source, the ripple effect is enormous. And while it's still a little early to mark our calendars, I do want to give a little snide nod to World Rivers Day. I know it's a podcast, but I'm nodding to all of you right now. And this falls on September 28th this year. It's a global reminder of how vital rivers are to our ecosystems and our futures.
Yes, Mark Angelo, the Canadian conservationist who founded World Rivers Day, said it best. Rivers are the arteries of our planet. They are the lifelines in the truest sense. And I think in the context of plastic pollution, that metaphor becomes even more literal because these arteries are being clogged up so fast. So it might just lead to the earth having like a heart attack. And we all know we are currently not in the position to cope with those consequences equitably and holistically.
Exactly. So with that framing in mind, let's shift gears and bring in today's guest, Rosa Hoeweling van Beek, who represents the Ocean Cleanup. She joins us today to talk about how communities, government, tech innovators are working together to stem the plastic tide, one river and one policy at a time.
Hello, Rosa. How are you today?
Hi, Kiara. Hi, Patricia. Thank you so much for having the Ocean Cleanup and myself on the Second Life podcast. We're very excited to be here and speak about our project in plastic pollution with you.
Wonderful. So before we jump into the nitty gritty of river plastic and cleanup strategies, can you tell our listeners a little bit more about your role at the Ocean Cleanup? What drew you to this mission? For the listeners who might not be familiar, what is the Ocean Cleanup's core mission and how it has evolved since its inception?
So perhaps I'll actually take your question in reverse and introduce the Ocean Cleanup and our mission first, and then go a little bit into my role. So the Ocean Cleanup itself was founded in 2013 by our CEO and current founder, Boyan Slat. And all of this started actually before 2013 and before the foundation of the company itself, when Boyan was only 16 years old. So our story is he was diving in Greece, where he actually encountered more plastic pollution than fish itself, something I think you've already touched upon a little bit. And so he started wondering, okay, how can we resolve this issue? How can we remove plastic from the ocean, and how can we do that? Which led to a TEDx talk with Delft, a university in the Netherlands, where he shared his vision of cleaning up the world's oceans. And this led to a crowdfunding campaign, through which he was able to start the Ocean Cleanup. So officially, 2013, here we are. And initially, through the name, as you can see, we focused on the ocean. And as you mentioned already, the North Pacific Ocean has the largest, we call gyre, so that's the accumulation zone in the ocean. So by 2018, after some design and R&D work, we launched the first system in the ocean. And then in 2019, we actually harvested our first plastic, what we call our catch. And from there, we also realized that actually what we're finding in the ocean is a lot of fishing gear, a lot of used nets, old nets, discarded nets that have been torn and ripped. And this is very different from the plastic we find on land. So as you already mentioned, actually, 80% of ocean plastic pollution comes from land. So then we thought, okay, what else can we do to stop additional plastic pollution? And this is where our river strategy comes in. So one of the first things we did was model which rivers are the most polluting as the pathways of plastic into the ocean. Now, this can happen for many reasons. Plastic can be thrown into the river, or due to rain and water floods, plastic can go into the river and then from the river into the ocean. And so now we have this dual strategy and our mission is to clean up 90% of the world's of the ocean of plastic pollution. And so we have this dual strategy to clean up, of course, the ocean itself, but also stop additional plastic flowing into it through our river projects. Right now, we are active in 8 countries with 16 projects, so in the Americas and in Southeast Asia. And of course, through this, we have a system of learning and readapting. So we actually have a whole portfolio of solutions. We like to say that no single river is the same. Every river has different characteristics. And so we have a range of solutions to suit different kinds of rivers. And sometimes this is a small barrier through a local canal, for example, or it's an interception in a very wide and big river where there's also traffic going through it. And I think another milestone before we get into everything to highlight is that in 2020, we actually had our first product from the plastic that we caught. So in 2020, we launched the Ocean Cleanup sunglasses as a proof of concept to show that, we can remove the pollution, but we can also turn trash into treasure. We can make value out of it. So from the ocean plastic, we turn the plastic into pellets, and then from the pellets into sunglasses, which we sold as part of the Ocean Cleanup brand and also helped fund part of the project. And now we are here in 2025, and in the UN Ocean Conference last month in Nice, which was one of the most pivotal moment, I think, for the ocean this year, we launched our new strategy. So moving from the 1,000 rivers to 30 cities. And I will touch more upon this later, but that is the research, the introduction to the ocean cleanup. One final thing to highlight is that alongside the projects themselves and being there on the ground, we also collect an immense amount of data. So with the plastic that we catch, we can see where it's coming from, what kind of plastic it is, how much there is, the changes between different seasons, between the rainy season and the dry season. And we also have developed a lot of technologies that I'll touch upon later, for example, using AI to help monitor this. And I would like to stress that cleanup is very important, but monitoring is equally as important, and also researching to understand the impact of plastic pollution, not just on human health, but especially the environment as well, and the marine environment too. So that's the introduction to the ocean cleanup. And I myself, like you actually, am in our public affairs team. So I'm an associate in our global public affairs team, and we manage the relationships with public stakeholders, so governments, but also international organizations, particularly within the UN system. And I myself am focused on blue innovative finance and our engagements with Asia and also with AI. And what drew me to the mission is, of course, I think plastic pollution, especially where I'm originally from Vietnam, by the way, and it's a very visible problem there. And we also have a project from Vietnam, and that's actually how I know about the ocean cleanup, which is very different to the case of where I am now in the Netherlands. So I think it's a very visible problem, but perhaps with hidden consequences in a way. And I'm also personally quite interested in rivers, especially when it's related to transboundary challenges. I think there's always an additional complexity when a problem becomes transboundary. But that's the introduction to myself and the ocean cleanup.
That's wonderful. It's nice to hear how you have your own like personal connection to it as well. And I think what you guys are doing with the sunglasses was really, really cool. To jump into where you were talking about the use of AI, like us at Second Life, your use of AI, to use it to imagine other advanced tech to detect and capture plastic. Could you go in a little deeper in how that works for you guys?
I would like to actually separate here our rivers and our oceans projects. So we use AI, and the main way we use AI is to monitor plastic pollution. And we have two different camera systems for this. We have one camera system for the high seas, and this is a UN Ocean Decade endorsed project. It's called ADIS, Automated Debris Imaging System. And this is a camera developed with our partner, Hyundai Glovis. And essentially, you can place the camera onto a ship. Once it exits the EEZs, so the coastal zones of countries, the camera turns on, and then it can detect floating plastic pollution. And what it will do is it will capture images, and it's able to identify this is plastic, this is not plastic, and then it stores the information. And this gives us an indication of where the plastic is. And it is extremely crucial to our project in the high seas because, as you mentioned, the Great Pacific Garbage Patch is 3 times the size of France. Now, to avoid any misconception about the garbage patch, it's not one patch. It's not just one solid piece of floating plastic that's double the size of France. Rather, it's a whole zone, accumulation zone. And within this area, there are hotspots of plastic pollution. So there are areas where there's more plastic pollution than others. And one of our core objectives of this year is to increase our understanding of where these hotspots are. So this AI camera can help validate our computational models. That's to guide our navigation system and our steering strategy to decide where to go in the patch for the most efficient cleanup. And then the second camera we have is called our river monitoring system. And it's similar in the case that we can place it onto a bridge. And then here it can detect facing the river, of course. And then here it can detect the floating debris and what is plastic and what is not, and give us an indication of, for example, how much plastic flows through a specific river in a specific amount of time. And with this AI technology, it helps us continuously monitor compared to standard methods. For example, we're able to monitor continuously and also collect a lot of data at the same time. So that's how we use AI. Essentially, it's for monitoring plastic pollution. And as I mentioned before, as I mentioned before, monitoring is very important, because if we want to have policies not only to support cleanup, right, but support all kinds of solutions, so support behavior change, support alternative packaging solutions, if to know that these policies or these innovative solutions are actually reducing plastic pollution, we need to not only understand first how much plastic pollution there is, but also how much it's reduced by after these solutions are put into place. So we see cleanup as not only as part of the solution to plastic pollution itself, but also as a way to understand if other policies are working.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I think that's super interesting for our listeners, because it's something that we have touched upon a little bit as well in this podcast. In fact, a couple of episodes ago on Trash Talks, we also briefly introduced this concept of AI for good and AI for bad. But we talked about particularly in the context of job opportunities, data security, and environmentalism. So what is your stance on this?
Yeah, it's, I think, a very interesting question also, particularly right now in time. And I think in a way, AI is not black and white, right? Like I think it really depends how we apply the technology. And I think in the case of the ocean cleanup, as I mentioned before, because it offers us a continuous way to monitor and it can solve specific data gaps that perhaps right now there isn't enough capacity to solve if we use standardized or not standardized, but traditional methods of monitoring. I think it's a way to essentially improve our knowledge and improve how much data we have. There are, I think, quite a lot of initiatives going on to create global databases, but the data itself is still lacking. And so I think in this sense, AI is part of the solution because it can help fill this knowledge gap. But at the end of the day, yes, I think it's very difficult. And in general, AI is something the world has to be careful with. But I think in this specific context, it can only help increase our understanding.
That's really great to hear. And to segue a little bit into the next section, you're part of the Innovation Alliance, or the IAGBT. What kind of collaborations have come out of that? And why is innovation such a crucial piece of the puzzle here?
Yep, that's a very good question. Why innovation is such a crucial piece of the puzzle. I think innovation is how the solutions come about, right? So a lot of solutions, they must be new. Some of them rely on technology, but some of them are also just new ways of doing things. And all of this is innovation. Essentially, the solutions to plastic pollution will come from this sector, which is why the Ocean Cleanup co-convened the Innovation Alliance for a Global Plastics Treaty with our partner Repurpose Global. And it actually came about because we were both on the ground at the Global Plastic Treaty negotiations. And essentially the Plastic Treaty, very brief introduction, is in 2022, the UN Environment Assembly created a mandate to establish an international legally binding instrument to end plastic pollution, including in the marine environment. And so they had 2 years to negotiate a treaty. Unfortunately, the deadline was not met. And in December, which was the end of the 2 years, in South Korea, Busan, there was no treaty. However, fortunately, states have agreed to continue the process. And we will actually meet again in Geneva in 2 weeks, where the states have 10 days to negotiate this treaty. And we were on the floor there with a bunch of other observers and a lot of other innovators. And what we realized is that there is actually no voice for innovation. We're all here on the ground. We're all trying to get support for innovation and states to recognize it as a huge part of the solution and on the ground implementation. But there was no united voice. And that is why we convened the Innovation Alliance. And right now since then, we've grown over the past 1.5 years to over 125 members working on all kinds of solutions. So alternative packaging or materials all the way to cleanup, like the ocean cleanup itself. And what we realized from this is that it doesn't matter what kind of solution you're developing. It doesn't matter where you are based in the world. One common challenge is getting the finance to actually scale the innovation, moving past the pilot stage and actually being able to implement your solution on a large scale. And so that's one of the main reasons why we created the Alliance, to unite the voices of innovators, to share our common challenges, and to communicate this, bridging the gap we say, between the policy and the innovation ecosystems.
I do agree that innovation is really the main focus here. I think it's super important because actually in Second Life, and we do tackle plastic pollution, with innovation. So I think that that was a really great point, and I think that we should try to use innovation more. So I think that this alliance is really a great solution, at least for the moment. Let's see how it goes. But talking a bit more about water politics, so plastic pollution doesn't respect national borders. We have been talking about this. So how do you approach international diplomacy when river plastic is entering from one country and then affecting another country's coastline?
In this sense, it's a little bit difficult, actually, in terms of data and research to say plastic from this country is now entering your coastline, for example. But it is, I would say, a good thing that it's recognized as a transboundary problem. And in this sense, I think, for example, through the plastic treaty, we can see this recognition and that lots of countries are working together to protect, of course, not only their own waters, but the waters at a global level. But yes, it's very true. Plastic pollution doesn't respect national borders, similar to other kinds of pollution as well, right? So we can see that with not biodiversity, for example, carbon, this also has no borders. And we can see how the world came together and with the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC. I hope that something similar can happen for plastic pollution. It is, again, difficult to scientifically say plastic from here is coming from here. We can, of course, create models based on the flow of the current and things like that. But I think one important thing to understand is once it enters specifically the ocean, plastic is exposed to a lot of elements. So it's exposed to the water, but it's also exposed to the currents and the waves, which can also cause the plastic to break up and fragment. So in that sense, again, it's difficult to identify like the plastic here is coming from this country, possibly because it's already broken down, right? But I think this issue specifically is something that's very important to the small island developing states. Because they themselves, of course, are not responsible for a lot of the pollution, but they receive a lot of the pollution. And if you look up online, small island developing states and plastic pollutions, you'll be able to find many articles and many, many stories about how their beaches used to be clean and now it's filled with plastic fragments and microplastics.
That's amazing. And you're working as accredited observers towards a global plastics treaty. Can you tell us and our listeners a little bit more about that process and what your hopes are for international policy? Because I know a lot of people, they hear about these like big conventions that happen and people working on these policies, but what's actually going on behind the scenes in the development?
Actually, because I already touched on it before, I mentioned that it was a 2-year mandate, right, to establish this treaty. And fortunately, we're still continuing for the final push now. And I think something to highlight, especially if you're looking from the outside in, is if there's a treaty in the next month, this will be one of the fastest multilateral environmental agreements that we have, barring the protocol for CFCs. But apart from that, it is one of the fastest and quickest negotiations we've had. And I think this really highlights the urgency that countries recognize the urgency that we need to do something about plastic pollution. So as an accredited observer, what we are allowed to do is we are allowed to be in the negotiation rooms. Of course, there's also more rooms and closed doors that we cannot enter ourselves. But what this allows us to do is we can hear the live statements from different member states of the UN, and we can understand what they are thinking. And it gives us insights into their own challenges at the national level, because I think a lot of countries have very high ambitions, but they have capacity challenges or financial challenges that will stop them from fully delivering. And I think this is why the treaty is so important. It's a question of how can the world work together to solve the common challenge of plastic pollution. So I think my main hope is, of course, for there to be a treaty, but not just for there to be a treaty for the sake of a treaty, for there to be a treaty that can actually end plastic pollution. And one main way, also from the ocean cleanup perspective, about how this can be done is a couple of things. So one, setting global targets, like we've seen in a lot of other environmental treaties. For example, reduce the plastic pollution leaking from rivers by X amount based on X baseline that has to be determined. So global target is one. The second thing is including the high seas, because the high seas is no man's responsibility. It is no one single country's responsibility, but it is the commons of the world. So it is all of our responsibility. And this is a little bit more challenging because, of course, it doesn't impact every country. But again, this right now in the current treaty text, there is support to clean up the high seas. So this is we are very happy with this. It's something we've been pushing from the very beginning. And then the final thing is support for innovation. And this is through, as I briefly touched on before already, financing to innovation to scale. One main point we're pushing is innovative finance. So these new financial mechanisms that blend both public sector and private sector financing, because no one can do it on their own. I think that's one of the key messages here, is that nobody can end plastic pollution on their own. So the government and their ministries and their development banks have to work together with the private sector together to fund innovation.
Yeah, exactly. I completely agree that no one can fight plastic pollution on their own. So we do need this collaboration that you were talking about. But you also mentioned that part of this international environmental collaboration happens behind closed doors. So what can you tell us about the dynamics or barriers in those rooms that the public often doesn't see, but they should understand?
I think one important thing is, at the end of the day, for example, after the treaty negotiations in Korea, the headlines read, "No treaty, states couldn't agree on things." But I think when you're there, you really see how complex the problem is. You're balancing the interests of more than 170 countries for them to agree, also because this process, by the way, is by consensus right now. So you have to agree on something from over 170 different standpoints. Now, there might be similarities, right, in what they want and what their demands are. But to be able to negotiate this is an extremely, extremely complex process. Not only do people have different objectives and goals, but they also have different economic situations, different priorities. So I think it's easy, to criticize the process from the outside, especially if you just read the headlines. But one good thing, positive thing for people to know is that there are so many countries and so many negotiators pushing very, very hard for there to be a strong treaty. So I think my hope really lies there as well, that there are over 100 countries. We call them the High Ambition Coalition. And there are so many people talking to scientists, talking to NGOs, getting the data they need, the information they need, the examples they need to show that it is possible to end plastic pollution. It is just an extremely complex problem.
That's really, really important. And I hope our listeners are very much engaged in what you have to say. Jumping into our 1,000 Rivers strategies and the 30 city strategy, you've identified 1,000 rivers as the main pathways funneling plastic into our ocean. But what surprised me the most, what was the most surprising to you when the data came back? Were there any rivers you didn't expect to be major contributors?
Actually, unfortunately, I wasn't at the ocean cleanup when we first produced the model, but I did take a look, of course, in preparation for this podcast. And actually, to my own surprise, I wasn't surprised at the results. I think, as you already touched on some of the aspects before, how it ends up in the waterways in the first place, you can see that there's definitely a pattern. And at the end of the day, these rivers are more focused in densely populated coastal areas and big cities. So I think in that sense, it wasn't too much of a surprise. I think the surprise was more how much plastic was coming out of the rivers rather than where itself.
And focusing on just 200 high priority rivers, which criteria do you use to define high priority? And is it the volume of plastic, the proximity to the urban centers? Is it maybe the lack of waste management, or is it something else?
So perhaps it's a bit easier if I also touch on some aspects that was taken into consideration for the model, right? So the modeling approach includes geographically distributed data on plastic waste, on the land use, on wind, on precipitation, and the rivers themselves. And so what the model does is it calculates the possibility for plastic waste to reach a river and then subsequently the ocean. So it looks essentially at more of a probability approach to the model. And so this is where the we understand, this is how we understand where the plastic ends up and in which rivers. And if you look at it, yes, there is a correlation with where the rivers are and proximity to urban centers.
Could you tell us more about the 30 city strategy, like how cities are selected and how they're working, like with, and how you guys are working with them amplifies your impact across entire watersheds? Like, do you have any case examples that you could use to explain to listeners, like what exactly you guys are doing?
So as I mentioned, and also as you mentioned, that going from 1,000 rivers to 30 cities, then this is a drastically smaller number, right? And part of this is, so there's a couple of reasons why we transitioned to this city strategy. And I think it really came from a learning process, and which is core to any kind of innovation. So what we learned, actually, it draws from not only where the plastic is coming from and which rivers we have identified as highly polluting. As you can imagine, a river flowing through a big city will have many different streams, and so the plastic is coming from these streams, right? But we learned from Kingston, Jamaica, Kingston Harbor, is that it's much easier to scale within a city than going by the 1,000 rivers. And Kingston, Jamaica, we have dubbed, you can take a look online if you Google Kingston Harbor, the ocean cleanup. We've dubbed it the first interceptor city. And what this means is we've been able to close off the harbor from plastic pollution, improving the water quality downstream. And so what we learned from this, it's much easier to scale within a city, but also if we look at actually where the rivers are, instead of looking by river, if we look at it and compare it to cities, it's really concentrated in the cities. And so our organization is really impact driven, and we want to make the most impact as possible. And so because of this, we've transitioned to the 30 city strategy. And looking at the impact, and also we take other things into consideration, right? Like, what is the available waste management infrastructure? You've also briefly touched upon this before. That is also very important, because for every city we analyze, we look at not just how much is coming out of the city or the river, but also, can we sustainably manage the waste there? We also do a waste management analysis. We also do an environmental social assessment analysis. We really look at the whole picture. And I think that is something that makes the ocean cleanup as an organization so interesting, is that we're not just doing the plastic part, but we're really looking into the environmental, the social, and the scientific side of things to make sure we're doing the best job we can, and to make sure we are leaving the most positive impact we can. And I think one really interesting example for me is actually the case of Las Vacas in Guatemala. So essentially, Las Vacas, and it's also a good story, I think, of innovation and relearning and going back to the drawing board and seeing where you can make improvements and efficiencies in the system. So in Guatemala, it's the Las Vacas project is something we worked on for a couple of years. And we initially had one design. As I mentioned before, we have a range of solutions, right? We had one design for the river. But in the rainy season, there was just so much trash coming through at once. And we call it a trash tsunami. So much trash came down the river at once after a big rain, for example, that the barriers would break, because it just couldn't hold. And we tried different solutions for this, right? Now, of course, now in the end, we have a very successful solution there. It's actually, I believe, one of our biggest catch sites. So we captured over 1 million kilos of waste in one go, like within over one day, just from this river, because of a huge storm that drained it into the river, right? I think the number is 272 truckloads of trash, if that's easier for you to imagine. And so that is a very interesting case for me for not only innovation and solution design, but also perseverance and ensuring that we know there's a lot of plastic coming from here, so we have to stop it, right, from entering the Caribbean. And what makes Guatemala also such an interesting case for me is what we were able to do with the river plastic afterwards. So one common question we get is, what do we do with the waste that we manage? Now, this really depends on what solution is locally available. Luckily, in the case of Guatemala, there was a sorting facility there, and also a facility that could process the river waste into plastic flakes. So very thin flakes of plastic, you can imagine. And from that, and our partnership with Coldplay, we were able to turn the plastic from Guatemala into an LP. So I think it's sold out now, but back in the last year, you could have bought an LP from Coldplay made with 70% plastic from Guatemala, for example. So I think this is such a good case of how we try to really not only create the biggest positive impact, environmental and socially speaking, but also to make sure that the plastic we stop from entering the ocean doesn't just end up back in it, right?
Thank you so much for that example. I think it was really, really useful to understand a bit more your work. I think our listeners, or I hope our listeners really understood a bit more about the ocean cleanup, about the 100 river strategy, the 30 city strategy, about innovation, about everything that we talked about in this podcast. So thank you so much for coming in here today, Rosa. We cannot thank you enough for helping our listeners to understand a bit more about water politics and everything around it. So that was everything for today. Thanks again.
And I think if I can make just one final closing statement. So of course, what we're doing at the ocean cleanup has a very high impact. In our new 30 city strategy, we aim to stop up to 1/3 of plastic pollution entering the water. And this, I think, is very impressive and a very ambitious mission. But it is, I think, very key to stress that we cannot do it alone, as I already mentioned. So two things. First, the ocean cleanup plans to put itself out of business. We do not want this to be a permanent solution for there to always be this level of waste, but rather as an interim solution while other solutions and policies come into effect. And then the second thing is our partners are so key to the projects and the operations, not just ones that I mentioned like Coldplay or Hyundai Glovis, but also the people working with us on the ground, like the UNDP. We have a partnership with them and they help us on the ground in a lot of countries, for example. So I think in general, I would just like to say that, of course, the mission itself is something that's necessary, but we also have to thank, I think, all the people locally or internationally that work with us and support us, because without collaboration, we cannot end this problem.
Yes, for sure. I think that's very important to you guys and to us at Second Life as well, is that every single person plays a part and everyone has a role. And I think that's very important for people to understand. It's like you can make a difference in just who you are as yourself, either individually or as part of a group. Like your action and input and care does matter overall. And so for all of our listeners, if you want to stay up to date with Second Life's work that we're doing both here on the podcast and to get notifications about when we release new episodes, you can visit our website where we also have opportunities to join or host a cleanup, apply as a volunteer, donate or partner. You can follow Second Life on Instagram at secondlife.ngo for more sneak peeks. And to our listeners as well, thank you so much for listening and participating and engaging with us. If you'd also like to hear more information about the ocean cleanup, you can visit them at their website. And just as a send off, remember your part does matter and everyone has an important role to play here. So I hope everyone has a nice day. And thank you so much again, Rosa.
And thank you again for having us on here.
Let's go. Big cold, shake it down.